It's very nice to be with you all. This is, as Anthony indicated, quite a peculiar situation. I'm sitting in Kabul, actually in the Ministry of Communications in Afghanistan, and it's in the wee hours of the morning. As Anthony said, we've been working on this for a long time, so it's very nice to finally launch this. Turkey is the case of among our three, and in fact in the entire world, that allows us to imagine what or in fact to see what a post-Islamist movement would look like, and how a group of people who began as real Islamists could evolve in this direction to the point that they now themselves fully disavow the label of Islamist and describe themselves as conservative Democrats. Unlike the other two movements we've heard about in Egypt and movements and parties that we've heard about in Egypt and Indonesia, in the case of Turkey, of course, the movement we're talking about has turned into a party, the AKP, which is now in government. It's a majority government. It's a very strong and popular government, and is doing quite a great deal to change the country. Let me first just review a little bit of the history of Turkey to give you an idea of where all this is coming from and the particular conditions that have made this trajectory of development possible. First of all, as all educated Australians will know, Turkey was founded by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Ataturk, of course, was the great Ottoman general who led Ottoman forces at Gallipoli, which is why he would be known to Australians, but he then led a nationwide struggle against an invasion by Greece that they were put up to by the Brits, managed to drive them out of Anatolia and to force all the great Western powers to accept a new treaty, the Treaty of Lausanne, which allowed them to establish the Republic of Turkey within its current borders. And that's a very important fact for a few reasons. First of all, there's a cult of personality around Ataturk. He's a revered figure, and everything about his ideology is considered largely sacrosanct. But it's also important because it gave the army, from the very foundation of the Turkish Republic, a credibility and a really deep popularity that I think few other countries can rival. And that's important to understand. Armies dominate many societies, and very often they do it simply because they have a monopoly on physical power. And in Turkey, it's much more than that. In Turkey, they also have moral power. They have moral authority, despite the sorts of shortcomings that any large group of armed men will be liable to over many decades. But they still bask in this glory of their role in the founding of the state. Now, the other important thing about Ataturk is the ideology he left behind. It has 6 points. I'll just mention two of them. One of them is laicism, and that is the idea that religion effectively should be controlled by the state. And some people with just a cursory knowledge of or familiarity with Turkey will refer to this separation of church and state in Turkey. Well, that's a great misrepresentation of the situation there. In fact, from the foundation of the Republic, there has been a ministry or a directorate of religious affairs that has controlled every mosque, has funded every imam, and has produced reams and reams of religious literature. The other important thing about his legacy is that he insisted that Turkey had ultimately a European vocation, that it was part of the West, and that it was bound to become closer and closer, both in cultural and in political terms, to Europe. And of course, when he died in 1938, Europe was a very different place from what it is now. It was a continent of nation-states that were at one another's throats and were soon to descend into the chaos and bloodshed of World War II. If he had lived a little longer, he probably would have helped articulate what Europeanism meant for Turkey in a way that would have been helpful to its subsequent development. But in any case, he died in 1938. And the leaders who succeeded him were left to understand that they had to continue this legacy of getting closer and closer to Europe, whatever that meant. The first thing it meant was joining NATO during the Korean War when Menderes, the prime minister, led Turkey without really consulting with anybody else in the country into the Korean War, and therefore was invited to join NATO and was a beneficiary of a great deal of Western economic support after that. He was overthrown in a coup in 1960, and this was the first great intervention by the army after the introduction of democratic politics after World War II. There was then another coup in 1980 against another center-right government that had presided over a decade of chaos, of fighting between forces on the right and the left. And these are very important to understand, too, because they impressed upon many people, not least the founders of the AKP, that the army is prepared to step in during times of chaos. Now, since the introduction of democratic politics, Turkish politics has always been dominated by center-right parties, and they have increasingly played on religious themes, although they weren't able to articulate those very explicitly because of the clear red lines laid down by the army, who saw themselves as the guardians of Ataturk's legacy of laicism, this the state's domination of religion. But in any case, they flirted with this and exploited religious sensibilities as much as they could, as any politician would, knowing that most of their constituents found those appealing. Well, at the same time, in the 1970s, there developed another movement that was more explicitly Islamist. That was under the leadership of an engineer from the center of Anatolia named Necmettin Erbakan. Erbakan was clearly an Islamist. He was also, though I'm not saying that this is necessarily follows from his being an Islamist, but he was anti-Semitic, or at least certainly virulently anti-Zionist. He was, in many ways, a clever politician, but he also was somebody who regularly provoked people who worried about Islamists coming to power. He did himself come to power, leading a precarious coalition government in the 90s, and that was overthrown in what was known as a postmodern coup in February of 1997. He had done a number of things to provoke that. It was shut down because of these provocations, which included trips to Libya and Iran, which were provocative to secularists or Kemalists, but in other words, not at all productive or helpful to Turkey. He also said unfortunate and provocative things such as that threatening that university professors would have to bow down to female students who wore headscarves, because at that time headscarves were banned, as they continue to be in public universities in Turkey, and that was a major plank in his agenda, was to reverse that ban. Now, under him, there was a broad array of people that included a number of younger politicians who drew a very important lesson from the party being shut down in 1997. From that time, which is basically when I came to Turkey and met these people, they understood that Erbakan was going to lead the party in a direction that would never allow it to come to power again, or if it did come to power, it would just be thrown out again. They would never effectively be able to rule or get anything done. Now, the fact that they drew that lesson, and the fact that there was that lesson to be drawn by the actions of other parts of the state, is what set the stage for the creation of the AKP. The first thing that happened was another party, the Virtue Party, was created, and right before that one was shut down, Abdullah Gül, who for a long time had been the foreign minister under Erbakan's government, had led a rebellion of what was called the Genç Kanat, the youth wing, within the party. And at a big party conference in May of 2000, he actually stood for the leadership of the party. Erbakan had been banned from politics, so he couldn't run himself, but he had a stand-in who was meant to win a unanimous acclamation, and instead he was challenged by the leader of this youth wing. Erdogan couldn't do it either, by the way, because he was banned from politics at the time for having read a poem or a verse from a poem when he was in Diyarbakir. This is sort of a strange story because although the story, the verse talks about using minarets as bayonets, the poem was by a guy named Ziya Gülkalp, who had been a nationalist hero at the same time as he had been a religious Muslim, like everybody was at the foundation of Turkey. And in fact, there's a huge street named after him in the middle of Ankara, the capital. So with both of those people out of the scene, it was Gül leading the youth wing against Erbakan's stand-in. He didn't quite win, but he garnered a huge number of votes, and Erbakan understood that this challenge wasn't going to go away. In fact, other people said that this was the beginning of an historical shift in Turkish politics, which indeed it turned out to be. The party then, the youth wing then went on to found the AKP and benefited enormously by an economic crisis provoked by a spat between Bülent Ecevit and the president at the time, as well as the corruption of the standard parties that had dominated Turkish politics for years. And they won in November 2002 34% of the vote. And because of the strange rules governing Turkish elections, that actually gave them an overwhelming majority within the parliament. Oh, I see my face is being distorted. Sorry about that. I hope you can at least hear what I'm saying. It's very strange, isn't it? I'm going to ask Engineer Hakim whether he can help us with this. So they benefited by this in winning this. They also benefited by huge demographic shifts. These are also very important. There were entrepreneurs in the middle of Anatolia who came to be known as Anatolian tigers, much like the tigers of Southeast Asia. These were traditional people who at the same time were very pragmatic enough to be very successful in business. They made a lot of money, and as often happens, making money makes one even more pragmatic because they became quite attached to keeping it and growing their businesses. At the same time, there had been a huge influx over the preceding years into the cities, creating a group of poor people who desperately wanted not to be poor. And these were what, in Australian terms, we would call aspirational voters. And they really fit, many of them, the classic mold of Howard's battlers. They were people who had traditional sort of red-blooded values, but at the same time were most focused on simply getting ahead in life in material terms. So these were their constituents. At the same time, because they had made this break with Erbakan, they were determined to behave in a more pragmatic fashion. That led them naturally to broadening the base, both within their constituents and also in terms of officials who were appointed to the cabinet. So they actually managed to persuade a number of people from other center-right parties to join them, people with absolutely no Islamist background at all, and in fact people who would have been very wary of Islamists in previous years, to join the party. And they also then managed to attract, by broadening that group, a different or a broader share of the electorate. Now, just to wrap up quickly by saying something briefly about their record in office, they won for Turkey something that the country had dreamed of for 20 years, which is the right to be considered a formal candidate for the EU. That was an extremely important thing symbolically, of course, and it also then gave them a basis on which to pursue reforms very aggressively, which they've done. They recognized minority language rights. They did away with the death penalty. They did away with state security courts. They abolished the state of emergency in the southeast. They also did a great deal for women. There are no women in the cabinet, however. We shouldn't get carried away about the depth of the sort of social revolution that they've presided over. But in political terms, everybody, including even The Economist magazine, agrees that their record in office has been mostly exemplary. Right now, just to bring you right up to date, yesterday, I think, or the day before, there began a trial of over 80 people who were accused of being behind a plot to overthrow the government. And these are right-wing journalists and military officers and others and academics who are accused of trying to set up a series of assassinations that would foment chaos and require the army to step in and overthrow the elected government. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Anthony. Thanks.
Thanks, Whit. Let me just say a few things in conclusion, then I'll open the floor to question. So that's the three case studies that we covered. The case studies stand very much in their own right, but at the same time, one of the really important things we tried to do with this paper was to bring the case studies together and make a comparison, to identify any consistencies that you could see across the three cases, and in particular, things that seemed to get stronger the more democratic you became. And what we did was identify, and the paper goes this in more detail, and I won't labour this too much, we identified 6 shifts that seemed to grow stronger the more democratic the case. First was a shift from Sharia state to Sharia values. As we've talked about, the founding idea, or the key idea of classical Islamism is the idea of pursuing an Islamic state whose defining feature is its implementation of Sharia. What we see, though, in these three cases, as you go along the three cases, is a shift more to Sharia values. The idea that you don't need necessarily a specific Islamic state, that it's enough for these parties to pursue Sharia values through existing legislative processes. Secondly, we see a shift from what can be termed Islamic governance to good governance. And that's not to say that Islamic governance is not good governance, but what you see is a shift from a concept of governance that is specifically Islamic to a concept of governance which goes beyond a religious definition, if you like. In fact, in all three cases, including even in the Egyptian case, as these movements and parties engage in democratic politics, even in the Egyptian case where it's quite limited, what you see is a gradual secularization of their ideas. Not of the movements themselves, but certainly of their ideas, in the sense that they are forced to engage on and respond to issues upon which Islam often says very little. And it's not always possible for them to demonstrate that the solutions or the policies that they propose have anything specifically to do with Islam. Thirdly, we see a shift from what could be termed the moral message of the movement to the morality of the messengers. As these movements and parties engage in democratic politics, as they try to appeal to a constituency beyond their immediate narrow religious constituency, the shift or the success of the party becomes much more dependent on the perceived piety and uprightness of the individual members of the movement rather than the specifics of the ideological message. And why that's important is because it means that there is then enables the party or the movement to be more flexible when it comes to ideological issues. Fourthly, and Witt touched upon this when he talked about Turkey, you tend to see a greater membership diversity as these parties again try to build a bigger constituency in a democratic context. And that in itself changes the identity and the nature of the party. We also see fifthly, a process of regeneration. And this is very clear if you compare the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt to the other two cases, where basically you do have younger members within these movements who are trying to come up in the movement, who have very different ideas, but who are not able to because the emphasis in the Egyptian context is on unity and preserving the movement from assaults from the outside. Whereas in a more democratic context, the opportunities for these younger members to come to the fore, and very, very much as Witt said in the Turkish case, are much greater. And finally, we talk about a shift in these movements' policies and ideas, where, often people will ask, well, will democracy moderate Islamists? And in our view, superficially, if you look across the three cases, that's certainly evident. But I think it's actually more accurate to talk about oscillation rather than moderation. In other words, what these parties become is more like normal democratic parties in Western context, where they don't wholesale shift to more moderate positions, but what you see develop in them are moderate, more ideological wings, more pragmatic wings, in constant kind of argument and debate about policy positions, so that on some issues these movements will shift towards something that's closer to their core ideology. On other issues, they'll be more pragmatic, as Greg mentioned, more of a kind of a zigzag motion. A final point. What we are not arguing, however, is that these shifts are the inevitable consequence of democratic participation by any Islamist movement in any context, and I want to be clear about that. And the paper concludes by looking at some of the factors that have been important in the three cases we've considered. And some of those factors include some of the things I've mentioned already, the existence of political competition, the decision by these movements a priori to be non-violent, the role of the legitimacy of countervailing forces in institutions. The point here is not to kind of set up some generalised idea that democracy in every case will moderate or normalise Islamist movements, but to identify some of the conditions under which it's most likely to happen. Thank you. I know it's taken a bit of time, but we have some time now for a few questions. From the audience. Please wait till the microphone arrives. Tell us who you are, and feel free to pose a question to any one of us. Just here. Oh, sorry.
Hi, my name's Doug Thompson. I've got a question for Whit. In relation to the supporter bases for the party in Turkey, you mentioned two main support bases being the Anatolian Tigers and, shall we say, Howard's Battlers, or the aspirational voters that have moved in from rural areas into the cities. Given that the ruling party in Turkey has actually prospered at a time of general economic prosperity across the world, and the fact that there are reports this morning that the IMF may have to provide assistance to Turkey, how do you think the ruling party will go in the future in less prosperous times?
That's a very good question. It's a problem, of course, that they're going to have less largesse to spread around, and it's been particularly a disadvantage to them when you compare their time in national government to the years leading up to that, when they were actually dominating city halls in Ankara, Istanbul, and other major cities, when they actually did have relatively large tax bases to play with, and were able to engage in welfare activities that meant a lot to their constituents. Obviously, with less to spread around, they have to find other resources to appeal to their constituents and hold them. I think the big thing they benefit from is that there's no credible alternative on the scene. If there were a credible alternative on the scene, this would probably spell real trouble for them, and it might drive them to some ideological excesses to appeal to their base, as we see people like Sarah Palin appealing to the base in the U.S. With demagogic sorts of remarks. I don't think that they'll feel compelled to do that. They'll flirt with it, as politicians always do. I don't think that they'll feel tempted to step over the line, first of all because they know how dangerous that is. They were one Supreme Court, Constitutional Court vote away from being banned this summer, and they know that could easily go the other way if it were to come up again, if prosecutors were to make a case against them. And at the same time, I think that they will feel that they don't really need to because there's no alternative. And the one other point I would make about the party that's interesting is that it's not only the Economist magazine that has lauded their performance in office, but the Turkish Businessmen's Association and all the industrialists of Turkey, who traditionally were a key part of the base of the Kemalist elite, who had traditionally been the great opponents of Islamists. So the entire business community has been very supportive of the AKP.
Richard Hill. I don't know, but I can ask this question in relation to Egypt, but what has been the impact on the PKS and the AKP of Saudi funding of schools and hospitals allied with Wahhabi proselytization?
We'll get Greg if you want to answer that.
On the PKS, very little impact at all. Oddly, it was a Saudi-funded institution in Jakarta which gave many of the proto-PKS activists the command of Arabic that enabled them to get scholarships to the Middle East and particularly Saudi Arabia, and that's where they came into contact with Muslim Brotherhood academics, many of whom had been driven out of Egypt at that time. But they are not Wahhabists. and they are not Salafists. In that regard, the Saudi connection here is not a particularly important one when we look at PKS as a political institution and its agenda.
Another question?
Shuri Wax. Yeah, I think that I was more interested in what their attitude is to the madrasas that cater specifically to the people from poorer backgrounds that we've seen already have spawned a number of the people like the Bali bombers and so on, and also what their attitude is to a number of the towns where they've brought in either their version of Sharia law. We've seen examples of where women are waiting alone at bus stops to go home and are picked up and arrested, supposedly on grounds of immorality and suspicion of being prostitutes.
On the madrasa issue, the number of madrasa we were talking about that produce terrorists is very small indeed. And in fact, if you look at the people arrested in recent years, the last 4 years, the majority of them have come from state schools, not from madrasas. JI currently has probably somewhere between 30 and 35 schools. Quite a few of those schools are actually teaching the state curriculum. So the recruitment into JI itself is taking place through extracurricular activities. This is something that most people in PKS don't have much care for, to be honest about it. It's not what they don't see this as a primary issue in Indonesia. Lots of Islamic parties don't. They think this is an agenda driven by the West. They acknowledge that Indonesia has a terrorism problem, but they often also have a lot of conspiracy theories that accompany this. For example, one common one was that the second Bali bombing was the result of a tourism war between Indonesia and Malaysia. So the Malaysians were putting terrorists up to this so that they would blacken the name of Indonesia in the eyes of international tourists and they would go to Malaysia instead. And members of parliament have shown me graphs of tourism trends into Malaysia compared to Indonesia and say, see, here's the proof of this. So you get this kind of in a way, very illogical thinking from people who are in fact highly educated and sometimes quite worldly, and that's a worry in itself. You mentioned the issue of, so I don't think madrasa issue is a really big issue for PKS, and it's certainly not something that they have any direct involvement in. The issue of local Sharia law or Sharia bylaws in these round about 40-odd districts of Indonesia, it's a mosaic. There are some areas where where these laws can be quite intrusive, quite discriminatory against women and minorities, and the laws are upheld. But in the majority of areas, they are not enforced with any rigour. And in fact, a recent graph that an academic produced who's been looking at this showed that the enactment of new bylaws, Sharia bylaws, peaked in late 2005, 2006, and since 2007, 2008, it's dropped downwards. In fact, there were no new Sharia provisions in 2007, 2008. So it looks as if this was, to some extent, an aberration, something of one particular period in time. And it's also worth noting that some of the local administrations that introduced Sharia laws because they said it would lead to more moral, more just form of regulation, the local governors, the local district heads have been arrested for corruption themselves. One of them's been arrested for having sex with an underage girl. So it's knocked a bit of the gloss off this notion that Sharia will bring higher morality with it.
I'm sorry, but we've reached the end of our time. I do urge you to either download the paper from our website or, more usefully for us, actually buy a copy for $20. And I'm sure that Anthony and Greg would be happy to sign it for you, turning it into a collector's item. The paper that was launched today is a really important piece of research, I think, and I do thank, on behalf of the Institute, the three authors who laboured very long and very hard to try not just to look at 3 case studies, but to work out what effective conclusions we could draw from what we are seeing. Please join me in thanking Anthony, Greg, and particularly Whit at very early hour in Kabul. Thank you very much.